Linux Luddites, episode 52, for the 6th of September, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. And this week, we go behind the headlines to discuss the recent IBM and Canonical mainframe news, the push for European regional governments to migrate back to Windows from Linux, plus a compulsory Windows 10 bit of bashing, and Paddy brings future input devices to our attention. Following that, we have plenty of your feedback, and then Paddy and I test 3 command line sync programs, hoping to improve on Paddy's roundup experience from last week. Let's see what happens. So, with that, let's go behind the headlines.
Well, as Jesse said, let's start off by talking about mainframes. And a few weeks ago at LinuxCon, IBM launched Linux One and also announced the Open Mainframe project. And also, Mark Shotworth announced that Ubuntu would be available for the mainframe.
Yeah, Linux One being a little bit of an odd name, given there are actually 2 of these mainframes. There's Linux One Emperor and Linux One Rockhopper. Emperor being the very, very top end for absolutely huge deployments with sort of thousands of processors able to scale up to 8,000 virtual machines. And Rockhopper being far more for sort of entry level or people who aren't trying to analyze vast amounts of data but still need something for a backbone.
Yeah, and as Joe suggested, Canonical are going to be pushing Ubuntu very heavily on this machine, joining Red Hat and SUSE. It actually got me thinking about SUSE with this story because we don't talk about them very often, but they are quite a big player and they kind of just glide underneath all the headlines.
Is that because they're just not very exciting? You know, they don't have an exciting desktop distro. I mean, OpenSUSE to me just seems a bit boring and corporate, really. Whereas at least Red Hat have Fedora. And Ubuntu is much more, well, I mean, they kind of started out as being more consumer grade.
I'm fairly sure we spoke on a reasonably recent show about SUSE moving to some kind of rolling distro, though, weren't they?
Yes, this is Tumbleweed, and I was going to say with Joe that you also have to work out which distribution you want to install, because there's SUSE, the enterprise version, which I agree we don't talk about very much, but probably because it's a very enterprise mainframe type item. And then there's OpenSUSE, which also has the Tumbleweed version, and I think they're rolling the periodic release into Tumbleweed. I think that's part of the problem. Is there's certainly for me there's some confusion as to which one you're supposed to download.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's down to the fact they don't try so hard for publicity as Red Hat do. I mean, I had a quick look at the financials before we started recording, and everybody knows that Red Hat is $1 billion company. But I wouldn't have been able to tell you how much money that SUSE make, and apparently it's about $250 million a year, which is no small change, really.
Is it fair to say that almost all of that revenue is generated in Germany, though? Or are they a truly international company?
Are you suggesting that because a lot of the reporting's done from the States, there's some bias there?
Well, I don't know, really. I just get the feeling that it's a German distro for German people.
I don't think that's entirely accurate. I mean, certainly it's more European-focused than Red Hat. But I suspect there's a fair contingent of folks all around the world running it.
It also doesn't help when I think the only interview from a SUSE sort of employee or guest on a podcast was unable, as far as I'm concerned, to actually explain why I should use it, other than it had a pretty color and a chameleon. And I was just hoping that he would explain what benefits it had, what particular bits of software, why the rolling release, this Tumbleweed, was better than sort of maybe Arch or some other competitive, if you can call it that, distribution. And he just didn't seem to do it. And if that's their PR, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, that's their PR, it's not really going to cut it, is it?
You're referring there to an interview I also heard that happened on Bad Voltage?
Yeah, that's the one, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to SUSE, my experiences of it have always been that it's a perfectly functional distro and it does what it's supposed to do, but it just seems slow compared to Debian and Ubuntu and even Fedora. I mean, for all of Fedora's ills, it is fairly swift. And given the same desktop environment, I would say Ubuntu and Fedora feel roughly the same kind of speed, whereas SUSE just seems to feel slower. So I don't know why that is, really. And maybe that's just my experience of it. Maybe it's just a hardware issue or something. But I've just never really been excited about SUSE. It was one of the first distros I tried out, but I've just never stuck with it, and I just wouldn't even dream of installing it.
Well, I think its default desktop is KDE, so it's never going to really kind of sit with you, I don't think. Also, you say it's slow, but actually, clearly, SUSE itself is not that slow, because it and Red Hat are the only two which are currently available on Linux One, and it's Ubuntu, which is sort of dragging its heels and isn't going to be ready for it until 2016, which is not ideal given this big announcement. You should be ready to go when it's been said.
Yeah, thanks for dragging it back to the actual mainframe story, Jesse. So, you mentioned previously that Big Box is capable of scaling up to 8,000 virtual machines or thousands of containers. I mean, what other advantages does this sort of kit have over traditional servers, Joe?
Well, as far as I can see, the main one is efficiency. Putting it all in one box means that you're going to use less power, and you'll be able to squeeze every little bit of computing power out of the box. But apart from that, I'm not sure, really.
You can also analyze raw data coming in live, I think. So if you're looking at sort of number crunching for financial districts and things, rather than having one big server talking to another big server and each one doing a particular job and therefore having to network between them, share disks and things, if it's all in one big cabinet and it can, I guess, number crunch far more quickly all this live data which is coming in.
Yeah, did either of you see the video, the presentation? It was quite impressive, the number crunching they were doing, getting live feeds in from the Twitter firehose and linking that up to the financial data to actually see the Greek meltdown as it actually happened in real time.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, and being able to pull in sort of how Twitter was doing things and put numerous sort of variable live feeds together in order to get some useful graphics out and be able to track who's selling and buying and what the effect is on a third variable. It was very impressive.
And of course, one of the big benefits of kit like this is that the virtualization is largely done at the hardware level. So whereas we're used to booting up a box and running virtualization software on top of that, a lot of it within the Z series or Z series, as they say in America, actually happens within the hardware. So it's near bare metal speeds.
Well, you linked us to an old podcast episode, Paddy, about mainframes that's very informative and kind of goes really deep into the advantages and what exactly a mainframe is. So we'll stick that link in the show notes for anyone who wants to learn a bit more about it.
And so often in the news, we talk about how certainly a lot of European cities move over to Linux or start using open source software. And there's a few articles here about how there's been either a bit of kickback or arguments that it's cheaper to actually run Microsoft or proprietary equivalents. So there's the Italian municipality of Pesaro, and they're saying that actually using OpenOffice is more expensive, and they've switched back to using Office 365, which currently is costing them about €500 per person over a 5-year period, and they reckon it's going to cost about 200 for the equivalent Office 365. And this is largely due to rollout and the complexities of being able to use what was previously a Microsoft product and then use it in OpenOffice. So there's issue between macros and things like this in Excel. There's no access equivalent and things like this. The problem I have with this is that it's all very well and good moving from Microsoft Office over to OpenOffice, or they should probably have moved over to LibreOffice to get more sort of compatibility. But to then move back to Office 365 is not really comparing apples with apples, is it? Because one's a net-based thing and one's a locally installed thing. So they're going to be different and cheaper, and probably, as far as I can see, 365 doesn't sort of allow the same functionality as a locally installed version of Office.
Yeah, and tell us about the report that this story is based on.
Well, given that this report was commissioned by the Italian city and Microsoft, it seems to be a bit spurious, doesn't it?
You could say there's some vested interest there.
Yeah, and in addition to the story there with the Italians, the classic example of Munich, there's been a couple of their councillors have written in to complain that they should move from Linux, their custom version of Linux, over to Windows.
Yeah, but most of the complaints seem to be we don't have root access to our machines. We can't install what we want, which in a corporate environment is just the norm, isn't it? I mean, you were telling us about how you can't do anything with the laptop work gave you. You can't even right-click on my computer.
Yeah, exactly. That you have to accept when you're in sort of large industry and corporations that the IT infrastructure is there to get a very core set of things done, not for you to mess around and install various other things that you fancy playing with. And they really do, certainly over the last year or so, have locked it down to the point where, obviously you can't install things, but also you can't even tweak things, change your background and these sorts of things. So I don't see it being a huge shock to me. And they're even saying things like, well, we should move to Microsoft because then we can have an Office suite that we don't have at the moment, and then we can have Skype. And it's like, well, you already have OpenOffice or LibreOffice in Munich's case, and it looks like the IT department decided not to install Skype because of security vulnerabilities. So even on Windows, they wouldn't have got Skype. It just feels like they're clearly not invested, they're clearly not sort of haven't bought into the Linux move and are complaining about things that they would be complaining about anyway on Windows.
Well, come on, let's be fair to these poor Germans. They've had KDE 4 inflicted upon them. No wonder they want to go back to Windows.
They don't seem to be able to tell the difference, some of them, because another story I noticed, and I'll stick in the show notes, was that some of the users who have been grumbling about running Linux, when the IT staff went and had a look, found they're actually running XP. So
I don't know which is worse.
Yeah, no, it's a bit of a toss-up there, XP or KDE 4.
There was quite an interesting talk given at DebConf recently, though, about Munich, and I'll link through to that in the show notes as well, which gives you a vague idea of the state of the play with the project, how many PCs they've changed over, and some of the challenges they're facing. So it's a good catch-up if you're behind the curve on the story.
Yeah, and the fact that they are a few years behind each Ubuntu release, so they are at the moment still using 12.04 3 years after it was released, and they're kind of preparing to base one on 16.04, but that's going to be in several years as well. So one of the big challenges seems to be being based on that old code base and having to backport stuff. So yeah, well worth a watch.
But part of the reason they are slow about it is that they're finding hardware support difficult, which I find interesting because, as going back to my experience with work, they will buy an HP laptop and everyone will get that HP laptop. So I'm surprised that they have such hardware problems if they're the ones controlling the hardware, both for desktops and laptops and things. And then as they get all these hardware problems ironed out, they realize that their operating system is no longer supported and out of date, and they have to then spend their time backporting kernels and Xorg updates and things. And so it seems like it's sort of not quite fast enough to keep up with the hardware, but then they're too slow to keep up with the software as well. It's a bit of an awkward position they're in. And maybe if there was a more standard kind of release that governments or at least different German municipalities could use and therefore pool their availability and IT support, they might be able to move a bit quicker.
Yeah, it was unclear to me from any of these stories how much central purchasing there was actually going on, because they were talking about a lot of different IT departments having a fair amount of autonomy, and then the central IT department who are actually developing Linux and trying to roll it out everywhere, having to liaise with all these different groups. So I'm not sure how much central control there really was.
Yeah, like 22 separate IT departments all rolling out the updates when they see fit does not give you a cohesive, kind of coherent kind of target to go for, does it? I think about our infrastructure, and the first time we had like a really big update, they didn't roll it out over a number of different sites at different times. They rolled it out to everyone, and so our entire company of thousands of staff all had to reboot at the same time, and the servers just could not handle so many people hitting them to log back on again, and it took us like half an hour to log back on because they were just overloaded. So there clearly needs to be a central, coherent kind of view as to how these things need to go. But I did promise some Windows bashing at the top of the show, so let's move on to that and Microsoft sort of basically listening to everything you say and do.
But let's start with the good news that Windows 10's on 75 million devices, according to Microsoft. Can you imagine Shuttleworth if he could get 75 million Ubuntu PCs in, 3 weeks or something? 4 weeks?
Yeah, I think it was 4 weeks, and Canonical keep trumpeting the fact that there's 25 million Ubuntu users worldwide. And how long's Ubuntu been on the market?
10 years?
10 years, 25 million, and Windows 10, 75 million devices in a month.
It must be an excellent operating system then. That's the only conclusion you can draw. Or they've strong-armed all Windows 7 and Windows 8 users into Windows 10. Maybe it's that second one.
Well, Paddy thinks it's pretty good, don't you?
I think it's perfectly reasonable, yeah. I mean, as a operating system, it's got its foibles, but the interface is an improvement over 8. It'd be nice if the start menu came back properly, but yep.
But what about all the privacy concerns then? I mean, I know you've tested it quite extensively. Are you not worried about the fact that it's phoning home every chance it gets?
Well, there's been masses of these stories in the press the last few weeks, and particularly from the more vocal advocates, shall I say, of free and open source software. And it always saddens me that rather than trumpeting what's good about our side of the world, people get off on bashing the Windows side. It's a negative message is not a good sell. You ought to be taking forward a positive message. But anyway, back to privacy concerns. Yeah, Windows does all sorts of nefarious stuff behind your back if you let it. You can turn a lot of it off. Some of it quite involved to turn off. You need registry hacks and what have you. But I think in a way the privacy policy, which has received a lot of stick in the press, is only telling you the full truth. A lot of the time these things are hidden and tucked away and you don't find out about them. And companies like Google do exactly the same thing, but it isn't so clearly laid out for you. And I think one of the problems Microsoft has got here is they have put it all in black and white, and everyone has picked up big sticks to beat them without realizing that everybody else is doing exactly the same thing. They're just not telling you about it.
Yeah, reading through some of these privacy concerns, they largely are based on the fact that it'll scour your information, whether it be your contacts, where you go, other data that it can find from your search history and things, so that it can implement them all into Cortana. And Cortana is a big sell at the moment for Windows 10 and also Windows Phone. And it means that you can ask it things where, can you remind me to do this when I'm there? And it obviously needs to know where you are to do that, or can you phone so-and-so from my contacts list? And it obviously has to have scoured your contacts list. But reading through this big list of things that it does and the hoo-ha and all these things that people have said, I did just kind of think, well, this is the same as what Google's doing. I don't see the difference. So, I mean, if you are in control of the operating system and you want all these things to be done through this new Cortana interface, let's call it, then you have control to scour everything and know everything about them. It's exactly the same as Android. Android knows who all my contacts are, and it knows where I am, and it knows what the weather is like. So when I ask Google, what's the weather like, and remind me to do this when I get home, it knows all these things. It's the same. It's just that one is on your PC and one is on your phone.
Yeah, I suppose that's a good point, that they are just being a bit more transparent about it than Google is. But what really bothered me about these stories is that they're essentially backporting a lot of this spyware stuff to Windows 7 and 8. So whereas I would recommend to people, if you're going to use Windows, stick on Windows 7, well, that just doesn't seem like that's a good enough answer, really.
No, there are fixes out there to strip all the telemetry stuff out, and I think one of the links we'll put in the show notes explains how to do that. But you're right, they're trying to get everybody in the same place so they can see what everybody's up to. And I guess it helps their software development as well. But going back to what Jesse was saying, I think it's perfectly right, because when I was reading these stories, my mind went back to your story of your trip where you took some photographs and they were mysteriously catalogued by Google, even though Google shouldn't have known where you were.
Yeah, it's collecting those two pieces of information, putting them together, and in theory, and trying to give it to you in a way that is more useful to you. And that's what Cortana is trying to do. But yeah, it is a little bit creepy that they track one device of mine. Okay, I chose to put my photos from another device onto Google Photos, and it had the automatic knowledge to marry them up. Was a little bit creepy.
So I guess the bigger picture here is that everybody's doing it, unless you're just running local applications. So I don't know whether we should be particularly beating up on Microsoft, or whether we should just be kicking up a stink about everyone doing it, or just writing all these big companies off and just running local apps.
But the way in which you would turn it off, or the way in which you would think to turn it off, is turn off Cortana and turn off, whatever tracking services there may be. But that, like you said at the start, doesn't turn it off. You sometimes have to do some really low-level type things to actually get it to stop. And that isn't really accurate. It should be clearly on the front, this is how you stop it, and then actually stop it all the way through. But in actual fact, they're forcing these things in the background for your your internet browsing history and your locations and things, even though you're not using the services which they're claiming are going to be pulling that all together to be more useful to you.
But how this relates to Linux is quite amusing to me. Remember the huge fuss about Ubuntu and Unity with the search in Amazon stuff, and how easy that is to turn off. You can just uninstall that lens, or you can just toggle the switch. And yet there was still this huge furore over it, whereas it's just kind of built into everything else, this proprietary software. And it just makes me realize how lucky we are that free software, open source actually exists, and that there are serious alternatives to this proprietary stuff.
And the last item I wanted to highlight on this list of things that Windows does was, I know you mentioned it on your Joe Rest podcast, where they share the Wi-Fi password. And I also thought that it shared it without your knowledge to all of your contacts, but actually apparently it's an opt-in feature. So that is the only sort of shining light through the dark cloud, I think, that while it sounded like it was a terrible thing that they gave your Wi-Fi password to anyone in your contacts list so they could connect to your Wi-Fi without having to tell them the password, you do have to opt in and allow that to happen.
Well, thankfully, it doesn't apply to me because I won't be using Windows 10 anytime soon, I don't suppose. So let's move on and talk about some fancy new hardware, and starting with the LG Rolly keyboard.
Yeah, on the news last time around, I actually suggested that one of the issues with mobile devices, be they actual phones or tablets, is the difficulty with input. And this looks to be a fairly good solution. Now, we've obviously got a whole bunch of Bluetooth-type keyboards out there, and we've also had roll-up keyboards before. But this looks to be a far superior implementation because it's actually got nice, firm, proper hard keys as opposed to nasty rubbery ones with a decent amount of travel on them. And it rolls up. I don't know how to explain that. Is it horizontally? It's lengthways anyway, isn't it? So it rolls into a stick, basically. You can just put in your bag.
Yeah, it rolls from top to bottom and becomes the length of a short keyboard in a sort of little oblong piece, which is basically protecting the keys inside. And I have a very similar keyboard, which I use if I ever take a Raspberry Pi outside or need a keyboard where you don't really want to take a normal full-size keyboard. But exactly what you said, it's one of those rubberized, waterproof, and it's just nasty. Even on a perfect desk, you can't really press them properly, and you have to make sure that every key you press, you record and make sure it's there. It's not the nicest thing to use. And this looks pretty snazzy. It's got a little pop-out stand as well for you to put your tablet on, so you can use the tablet as a screen and type away with it as a laptop would have. A bit like the Surface, I suppose.
Yeah, the one thing I couldn't find out about this, though, was how much they're intending to sell it for.
How much would you buy one for?
I would have thought no more than £75.
Oh, I would not buy one if it's that expensive.
Same, no way.
It would have to be half that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the main problem with these kinds of things, that they are very expensive. I mean, if you've got a very expensive tablet to go with it, then you can kind of justify it. But you can get a Nexus 7 now, the 2013 model, in Argos, brand new, for £100, or the Nexus 9 for £200. So if you've got a tablet for that kind of money, spending 75 quid on a keyboard just seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, the engineering involved is actually quite intricate. I think back to I used to have an old Dell foldy keyboard, and that was really natty, and they're really highly prized. If you actually go and try and track one down somewhere, you'll easily be paying that much for a second-hand one.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe I'm underestimating the cost of, and also to have nice hardware. The rubbery one I've got is horrible to touch and use, and it cost me like 15 quid, and that's a direct reflection of its price. Whereas this does look like it rolls up nicely. It can connect to 2 Bluetooth devices, so once it's unrolled, it turns on automatically. It'll connect automatically. There's a little switch for you to be able to switch between a phone and a tablet, let's say. So it's got it all packed in. I think for someone who wants to use a tablet on the go as a PC, maybe at conferences and things, it would be a must-have, and therefore, yeah, the sort of £70 price mark they'd be willing to pay.
Well, if you think that's probably a little bit steep, I don't know what you're going to think about the Sensal Morph, which has been getting bucket loads of press. It seems to be quite an impressive device, but it costs $250.
That's a lot of money for essentially a wireless keyboard, but it's not just that. It's that and a lot more potentially. You've got a big keyboard-sized touch surface that is actually resistive rather than capacitive, but it's much higher resolution than most resistive touch surfaces. And then you can overlay that with rubberized magnetic keyboards or anything that you can 3D print or imagine pretty much. And so the classic case for me would be a touchpad on one side and keyboard the rest of it, but you can make it a MIDI controller with a keyboard or with knobs to control synthesizers, or you can do all sorts of stuff with it. I mean, in the video, the promotional video, they show makers using it to control robots. The possibilities are pretty much endless with it. So it does look very, very impressive, but that price tag, it's the kind of thing I would have to wait a few years for the price to drop, I think.
Yeah, it looks like one of those sort of Wacom tablets that you can use pens on and also your fingers and sort of a huge mouse pad. But I mean, they even showed using brushes on it in order to, use software like GIMP and get that sort of brush effect. And that is impressive to get the difference between a brush stroke and a forced pen input. It's got that whole range. And like you say, with these clip-on covers, you can maybe have a musical one where it's got keyboard sort of keys or a gamepad and things like this. So there's a huge range. And if you're able to get rid of a load of other things, like not have to buy a Wacom tablet, not have to buy a gamepad controller, and not have to buy all these other things, then it could actually replace quite a few sort of input devices. But you're right, it would have to get to that point where you need multiple input devices. How often do I need a really big touchpad? I think it's going to be for graphical people and people who make more sort of creative type things on their PCs.
Yeah, well, clearly it's been appealing to quite a few folks because this is a Kickstarter that we're talking about. They were asking originally for $60,000 and they've raised over $250,000 so far.
Well, that'll do it for Behind the Headlines. Let's move on to the feedback. First of all, then, a huge thanks to our new monthly supporter, Christopher Phillips, and to all the existing monthly supporters. And also on Flatter, Deb1046, and SH Trum. I think that's how you say it. Thanks a lot, guys. It really helps out.
It does help out an awful lot. Thank you very much indeed.
So if you want to get in contact with us, you can email us at show@linuxluddites.com or find us on Twitter, Facebook, Google+, or leave a comment on the website.
Well, thanks to everyone who took our recent comments about Fedora in the tongue-in-cheek spirit that they were intended. And an honourable mention to Top Slacker, who gamefully admitted to being one of those Fedora on the desktop, CentOS on the server, and MacBook-wielding types that we were gently poking fun at.
Yeah, Fedora doesn't get a lot of love on this show, but we do realise that it's one of the more popular distributions, so maybe we should give it a bit more time. Well, Jed Reynolds contacted us through Google Plus and said, there is still a remarkable amount of embedded 32-bit hardware about, like the Raspberry Pi, BeagleBone, and router board type network devices. Also, 32-bit guest VMs are logical if they'll never grow beyond 3 gig of memory, and you'll possibly use less memory and space by not needing a 64-bit alignment in libraries and memory structures. My biggest beef with Fedora on 32-bit systems is that they think they want to be a desktop system. However, developers like myself run Fedora in droves as headless boxes and headless VMs because we're tracking closely to upstream libraries, especially for kernel and network advancements, and Wi-Fi drivers in particular. Fedora provides a well-known Red Hat-esque environment that large clients recognize, which gets many contractors and vendors into very long sales cycles.
All good points, so maybe Fedora might think twice about abandoning 32-bit.
Yeah, but part of their spiel is to be on the cutting edge, and is that not give them sort of justice to make these kind of crazy remarks and do weird things? Red Hat can't possibly do anything like this, whereas Fedora can rock the boat and try new things, and whether that be dropping old things as well.
Well, as far as now CentOS is part of Red Hat and owned by them, maybe I suppose CentOS could be the one that supports 32-bit and Fedora can just go off into the wild and be cutting edge and 64-bit only. So yeah, that could make sense, I suppose.
Well, let's skip back behind the headlines and some commentary from Brindle Oak, who said, I had to beat a temporary hasty retreat to Windows 7 a while back when something in SSL broke on my Arch Linux setup and I could no longer access my Office PC via Citrix. I've been too busy recently to move back, and now I've been upgraded to Windows 10. And to be honest, it's all working so well, I'm not sure I'll be back on a Linux desktop distro, at least until the boredom really sets in and I just can't resist. But now, I'm thinking that in good conscience, I can no longer recommend to friends, colleagues and family members that they dump this latest Windows from their machines and switch to Linux. If I'm not alone in this sentiment, I wonder how much damage this will do to the Linux desktop. Will Microsoft kill the Linux desktop as a realistic option for all but the keenest enthusiasts and FOSS disciples?
Will it? Surely it has, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, even more than we currently are.
Well, maybe, but I don't think there are many normal people using Linux on the desktop, are there? Surely it is all enthusiasts and FOSS disciples.
What about the host of people that you've switched over to Ubuntu or various distros in the past?
Well, yeah, I suppose so, but that's all because they know someone who's an enthusiast.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's been a lot of commentary, as we mentioned earlier in the show, from FOSS enthusiasts, I'll put it that way, suggesting that Windows 10 is a total disaster and this is a really good opportunity. And I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, Windows 8 wasn't great. I think Vista was the last great opportunity to get people to switch over to Linux. And we fluffed it that time around. And we haven't had the opportunity this time. I don't think we're going to get the opportunity this time because Windows 10 isn't as bad as it's being portrayed.
Well, yeah, certainly to the average user who just turns on the computer and starts using it and doesn't realize what it's doing in the background with all the privacy stuff. From a user experience point of view, I mean, I presume it hasn't changed since that preview that I briefly looked at. So in terms of that, people aren't going to see a problem with it. They're just going to get on with what they've got to do. They're going to be able to get their email and Facebook and all the stuff that they normally do. So I don't see Windows 10 as a particular opportunity for Linux adoption at all, really. I think 8 was more than you're making out, Paddy, more of an opportunity. I know Vista was horrendous, but 8 was so different, and people were either having to accept this huge change to Windows 8 anyway, so it was kind of easier maybe then to say, well, if you're going to have this huge change, why not have less of a change to something like Linux Mint, which ultimately is fairly similar to Windows 7. So I really think that 8 was a huge missed opportunity, and maybe missed opportunity is the wrong word. We probably did end up attracting a lot of new users at that point, but they're just not particularly vocal, and they're just getting on with it, and they're using Linux Mint or maybe even Ubuntu or even Fedora, and they're just getting on with what they've got to do, and we never hear from them.
Yeah, or even Fedora. But no, I think you're absolutely right, Joe. I think my flatmate uses Windows 8. He bought a new laptop 6 months ago, and it came with that. And he hates it. He can't understand how it works or why you have this stupid screen with things, and it's not a touch screen, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And he is waiting for the Windows 10 forced upgrade to come along. And I keep on telling him it's going to be more like Windows 7. It'll be fine, carry on. But I think it is a big change to how people know their desktop to work, and that is more shocking than Vista, which was just slow and clunky and annoying and kept on asking you to type your password in. So I agree with Joe. I think Windows 8 was a big opportunity to give people a desktop they recognize, and it maybe just didn't happen. I don't think it's because we weren't ready or the distros weren't there. I think it's just people will put up with Microsoft because they aren't going to reinstall on a brand new laptop or even an old laptop.
Well, if you think missteps from the competition, and we're viewing Microsoft as the competition, or a lot of commentators are the opportunities for free and open source software, I mean, how many bites of the cherry do we want?
Well, I mean, I'd like to say that Windows 8 was an opportunity, but the reality is that it wasn't, because, as Jesse says, people just are going to stick to Windows, because until you can buy mainstream machines running Linux, the people are going to buy Windows machines, and the idea of changing your operating system is so alien, and now is actually quite hard with Secure Boot, that it's just never going to happen for the average person, I don't suppose.
Yeah, I think about how I started with Linux, and when I was at university, I was embedded in XP, as everyone was. That was the operating system, and one of my friends halfway through university started to dabble with Ubuntu, possibly Warty Warthog, like way back in the day, and And he said, you enjoy computers, you like messing around, why not try this? And it was only after university, after I'd written all my theses and things and had got my degree and everything could then change and I could change into a different operating system, I did. But had it not been for a friend sort of recommending it and showing me the ropes and holding my hand, I wouldn't probably have taken that plunge into the Linux world. And I was quite a sort of tech-savvy, computer nerdery kind of person. So if you're not ready to do that from where I started, I genuinely can't see, the average person just going, right, I know what I'll do. I'll find this operating system I've never heard of, I'll install it and wipe everything on my computer and then not quite know what dist upgrade is. I think it's a much more daunting step than us common Linux users sort of appreciate. Well, Florian commented on our piece about JavaScript being too powerful and asked, what about WebAssembly then?
What about it indeed? I mean, the browser is becoming the only thing you're going to be interacting with, and the operating system it's sat on top of is going to be largely irrelevant very shortly.
Yeah, we're talking about running bytecode directly in the browser, completely cross-platform. So yeah, it just won't matter at all what operating system you're using.
Yeah, well, he switches topic fairly quickly and says, so a government is supposed to spend money on the things that the marketing folks claim get the job done, instead of doing something for the public good and contracting someone to write free software to solve this problem for everyone. And then the freaking government isn't allowed to poke the software for any issues, especially with those gigantic Oracle databases with financial and HR data. Well, the various governments then clearly have to get some regulations in place to allow them to audit the proprietary crap they paid for. So this was in reply to the government discussion we were having, and also the fact that Oracle's chief security officer said that people weren't allowed to take their code and reverse engineer it because that's not what the license allows.
Yeah, and I must admit I had a little bit of a back and forth in the comments on the blog as well with Enrique, who took exception to me saying that perhaps Mary Ann Davidson had a point on this issue about the reverse engineering side of things. And I think we agreed to disagree at the end of the day.
Yeah, it was an interesting little discussion to see. And you can see sort of both sides of it, but I think that it's a case of how you want it to be and how it actually is. And if you've signed that, I side with you, Paddy, if you've signed that license agreement, then if it says you can't do these things, then I'm afraid you can't do it. If you were to take your car apart and break it and go back to ask them to fix it, that's your problem. You've gone beyond what you're allowed to do.
I suspect not everyone listening will agree with us, but let's move it on at this point then, I guess. And Moritz got in touch regarding show 50, where Ivor O'Connor mentioned that he wasn't able to find a free option for GitLab, and said the good news is that there is a free, gratis option on their hosted server. Sadly, it's not at all easy to find. And then Morris gently but rather sarcastically pointed out the link on the homepage.
Yeah, and he continued, another piece of feedback mentioned that GitLab indeed has a proprietary enterprise edition. This version supports features like integration for LDAP, Kerberos, and Jira, as well as branding and other smaller things. After the shutdown of Gitorius, GitLab's open core model was discussed on the mailing list LibrePlanet. After a while, RMS joined the discussion. Following the discussion, there was a guest post on the GitLab blog written by Mike Gerwitz talking about the problems with two versions and GitLab from the perspective of a free software activist. Some listeners might find the article helpful and a good overview about the GitLab licensing situation.
I like the fact that when there's a story or an article about these things none of us use GitLab, but clearly there's multiple listeners out there who do and who have experienced the various paid for and free versions. So yeah, we'll put those links to the free as in gratis and also this article Joe just mentioned in the show notes.
Lars Falk Peterson got in touch and said, big fan of the show, which is always a good way to start a most if you're going to get it read out on air. Discovered you after Outlaws ended, and I've listened to the whole back catalogue since then. I like the critical and honest views you have. I do, however, think I'm a bit more extreme than you are, as I never use Google, have OwnCloud as my Dropbox replacement, no gaps on my phone, and Firefox all the way. I'm also lucky enough to be working in a mostly Linux office environment, with some Macs. We even use and enjoy GitLab, and you did ask for that feedback last episode. I'm writing not only to compliment you, I also have a find, or just something I'd like your view on. And a bit of software Lars was talking about was SyncThing. It's an open source BitTorrent sync replacement. That is, it syncs one or several machines and all nodes are equal. They will auto-discover on the LAN or via internet. It seems way more secure than OwnCloud, but a bit harder to use. There's an Android app which can run in the background and keep, for example, your pictures in sync. A nifty feature for the security conscious or those with data caps is to only let it run on your local area network and never sync via the internet.
Well, a nifty feature for the security conscious is not to let it go on the internet. I'm not sure that's a feature. That's just not going on the internet to prevent anything from happening.
Yeah, but to be fair, I don't think you can do that with BitTorrent sync. Only sync over the LAN, so it is a good feature, I reckon.
Okay, well, maybe I'm thinking of the syncing programs we're about to talk about in the later segment of the show, so we'll come back to that. But we didn't look at sync things, so maybe we will see it in a future episode.
Well, moving it on then. We had a lot of people get in touch to thank us for the interview with Ron Minnick about Coreboot, and thank you again to Ron for actually taking the time to talk with us. Some of you are quite surprised how key Google has been to the whole project in recent years, including Will, who wrote, "I'd like to see completely open source systems become a practical reality one day, so I appreciate you bringing someone central to that work onto the show." That said, I was a bit baffled by the things Ron said. I was expecting him to tear purism down as others in that field have done. I also didn't realise Google played such a large role in this area. I think there is room for optimism though. As you guys mentioned yourselves, as Moore's law comes to an end, it takes longer for devices to be obsoleted by newer versions, and hopefully that will eventually give people working on open hardware and open firmware the time to catch up.
Yeah, with my listener hat on, I have to agree with Will. I was surprised that he was so sort of complimentary and optimistic about the Purism project, and nice that he'd had lunch with the guy and discussed it, and seemed to have. I got the impression that he maybe had a similar view set as most of the people, that Purism wasn't able to do what it was claiming to be able to do. But clearly after talking to him and being in the position that Ron is, was able to see that they may actually be able to achieve what they're setting out for. And similarly, the number of developers that were from Google helping on Coreboot was really surprising to me.
Well, I mean, being such a pessimist, I think Ron was being far too optimistic about Purism. I just don't think that they are ever going to do it personally. But as I said at the time, maybe Todd, the guy from Purism, knows more than I do. And maybe he's had some meetings with Intel. It seems very unlikely that such a small company could deal with them. But you never know, with all the threats from ARM and everything. Maybe Intel might change the way they're doing things. But it seems unlikely to me.
One of the things Ron was talking about was pre-installation of Coreboot on laptops, and he's talking about companies like Glug Glug. And Alex got in touch and said, "I found the interview about Coreboot very interesting. I had a look at the website that sells the LibreBoot laptops, and they seem to be extremely expensive. I bought a Lenovo X201 last year, with similar specs to the most expensive LibreBoot X200, except mine has an i5 and a touchpad, and it only cost me $450 Australian dollars. I had a quick look on eBay, and you can get a refurbed X200 for $190. These people are on drugs if they think that many people are going to pay over £400 for an 8-year-old laptop that doesn't even have a touchpad. Most of the cost of the machine is the installation of LibreBoot itself. If you can afford to spend £160 to have a LibreBoot chip installed in your laptop, wouldn't you want a nicer laptop?"
Well, there's a couple of things here, and I replied to Alex and said that the cost is so high because it's not just a case of flashing some software on there. It is opening it up, soldering things. I mean, we looked into it for your X200, Paddy, didn't we? And decided it was far too much aggravation. So that's kind of justifiable, the expense, I think. And it's really for people who are seriously interested in software freedom. And as for a newer laptop, well, the newer laptops aren't capable of running Coreboot, never mind LibreBoot, because of the way they're locked down. And if you want anything even vaguely modern, it's just not going to happen, at least not yet. So the X200 is pretty much your best bet if you want a totally Libre laptop. And if you're not willing to pay that much, I mean, you got yours pretty cheap, Paddy, didn't you? Like 80 or 90 quid or something.
Yeah, I think it was 80 quid.
And that was even a couple of months ago, so they might even be cheaper now. So it is very, very expensive, but there's a lot involved with it. It takes a lot of expertise, a lot of equipment. And, you know, if that's your job to do that sort of thing, you have to be paid for it. But it's just an unfortunate fact that if you really do care about software freedom and you do want a totally free laptop, you're going to have to pay over the odds for something that's a bit old and clunky. Although you love yours, Paddy, so, you know, but you wouldn't have paid 400 quid for it.
Hell no.
Ending on some Firefox feedback from Will, he says, As if the UI changes weren't enough, Mozilla is going to make it even harder to tell the difference between Firefox and Chrome. And he's just talking about how Mozilla is changing how the extensions will be able to operate. My immediate reaction is disappointment. I've put a decent amount of time into writing and maintaining a couple of Firefox add-ons myself, and the main reason I still use Firefox over Chrome has been that its add-on system was more powerful and provided complete control over the web browser. Now, I'm not sure what the differentiation will be. If all the changes work out to the best of Mozilla's intentions, maybe it will be a little faster than Chrome. I don't see Mozilla having the resources to do better than parity with Chrome in terms of security. Firefox would always lag Chrome in terms of support for web content and media due to licensing issues, I think. To me, those are all of the main browser metrics: performance, security, media support, and extensibility. Not all change is progress, but it's good to strip things down and rebuild them from time to time to remove cruft. So I like Mozilla's intentions with some of these changes. But it's hard for me not to see this as Mozilla choosing to remove one of the main aspects that differentiated it from its main competitor.
Yeah, I don't think we spoke about this change to how extensions are going to work in Firefox in the news on the show. But fundamentally, they are changing it entirely, because previously extensions were able to go and access any part of the Firefox code base they wanted to. And that's not going to be able to happen anymore. And they're implementing a very Chrome-like API for extensions to work against, which will provide a lot less functionality.
But a lot more security.
Yes.
So it makes sense from that point of view, but as Will points out, it's just more aping of Chrome, and it's going to get to the point quite soon, I reckon, where there's essentially no difference apart from Gecko versus WebKit. I mean, it wouldn't even surprise me if they abandoned Gecko and went to WebKit like Opera did, and then there would literally be no difference apart from the fact that Chrome isn't open source. But then what would be the difference between Firefox and Chromium? Well, virtually nothing but the name.
Yeah, I genuinely think that Mozilla should make Firefox stick to the sort of Mozilla core principles of openness and open standards and things, and dropping the DRM, because they're basically, as he pointed out, chasing the competition, and all you're going to do is try and be almost as good as the competition, because by chasing, you're never actually going to overtake. Whereas if they just let the competition go, ignore the percentages they should be trying to get of the web market and things, and just stand by their principles, those people who share those principles will never move. And there's this big furore about them including DRM in order to allow some web media to happen. But I think that they've basically ditched their principles in order to chase market share, which they're never going to win at. And I just think that Mozilla and Firefox have lost their way a little bit in what their goal is.
Well, as for these extensions, surely a happy compromise would be to move over to the Chrome way of doing things by default, but have an option buried in about config where it says here be dragons and all that stuff for people who want to have more flexible extensions that can do more. But for the average user, just keep it locked down and secure. I mean, like in Android, how you've got the toggle switch for untrusted sources. I like that way of doing things. Keep it secure by default, but allow us the freedom to do what we want if we know what we're doing.
Yeah, but I think one of the issues is in the past, extensions have broken on a regular basis because they were tied to the internals, the guts of Firefox, and Mozilla quite happily going along changing the internals. Why shouldn't they? It's their product. And when you've got things so tightly coupled, that's going to happen.
I suppose so, but you say, why shouldn't they? It's their product. Well, for that very reason, third-party extensions and APIs and stuff, it should be consistent and shouldn't change all the time, as far as I'm concerned. But as you say, I suppose it is their product and they can do what they want with it. It just means that people might stop using it.
And if people stop using it, they don't get a bigger market share, so they're not even winning on that point either.
So what do we reckon, Joe? You gave Canonical until the end of the decade, I think. How about Mozilla?
Haven't decided yet. I think that you're right. They will go away eventually. The Firefox code base will be out there and Thunderbird will be out there and it'll be taken on by someone and it'll be, probably a niche product that some people use. But Mozilla, the way they're going, I don't know. Probably longer than Canonical, but not that much. You can't pin me down yet. I'll ask me again in another year, maybe.
Okay, I will do. Meanwhile, let's move on to the group test.
Bidirectional file syncing is not something that I ever use. And given that Jesse managed to get out of accessing Linux partitions from in Windows, I thought I would opt out of this one, the group test of syncing utilities. So I would like to say a lot more, but I've got nothing to say, so I'll hand it over. Who's going to take this then?
It's kind of ironic that Lars flagged up in the feedback that he'd like to hear our thoughts on sync thing, because that's obviously a fairly well-known tool for doing this sort of job. And it's just something that's always gnawed at me, that there isn't a good way to do two-way directory syncing in Linux. I mean, people, if you mention it to them, will say, use rsync, but rsync doesn't do a good job of bidirectional syncing. It's great for one way, and as soon as you try and use it to go both ways, you'll end up with problems with files being deleted in the wrong place or all sorts of other hassles. And generally, rsync is also very complicated for the end user. And there really ought to be a tool out there, I think, that does a good job of bidirectional syncing and that is very easy to use. So I went away and did a little bit of research and came up with 3 things that looked possibles in this case. And I suspect I didn't do enough research, really.
Well, I think you can be entirely forgiven if we remember back to last week and the photo episode. So you've picked up bsync, csync, and bitpocket. And I will agree that one of them, I think we just need to put in the bin, and the other 2 are contenders. Now, you mentioned rsync there, and for backup, I've used rsync in the past, and I've never considered doing anything more than using it to back up from a NAS to a remote backup location. So it's only ever been one way. But as you say, if I was to use 2 locations to send my backups, I'd be stamping all over previous files and things.
Yeah, and it's quite a common use case as well. I mean, it's not something obscure. I mean, if people have got multiple machines, I mean, it's why you use things like Dropbox, for instance. You can access and update things in multiple locations, and those changes are reflected back to all of your devices. And I find it very useful because I've got a PC at home, I've got a laptop I take to work, and sometimes things are updated in both locations, and I want to see those changes reflected.
So kicking off with bsync, it's just a simple Python script that you download from the guy's website, and it just runs rsync, but with a number of checks and balances to make sure that it updates and doesn't override, and it, does the dual copying thing that we've been talking about, which rsync wouldn't do.
Yeah, and it has various options for the conflict resolution, doesn't it?
Yeah, so in my setup, I had my PC, my laptop, and my server. And I used my server as the sort of single point where they both communicated. And therefore, if I changed something on my laptop and synced it with the server, and then secondly synced my PC, it copied those down. But if there was some sort of error, it would say, do you want to delete this or keep it, or what do you want to do? So it's quite easy. And it also, I like the fact that you just basically said, / for running the Python script, so / bsync, and then folder 1 that you want to copy from, folder 2 that you want to sync it with, and it synced those 2 folders, one local, one remote. And that worked fine whether I was doing it from 2 folders within the same machine, or a folder to my server, or when I was traveling on holiday from my local machine, across the internet to my server. And you just had to, select the port and include your username at external IP address, and it would do it all in a simple way that SSH works, and it all just was very familiar and very easy to use. And it didn't matter sort of where you were in your file system, you just had to point it at the folder you wanted to sync locally and the folder you wanted to sync remotely, and off it went. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I'd largely agree with you. I thought it was easy and logical to run and does work well locally or over SSH. In the interactive mode, it does prompt on conflicts and asks you what you want to do. And when you've told it, or if no conflicts are present, it asks you again before syncing the 2 directories. Now, this is where I had a slight problem with it because it's supposed to have a batch mode, and it does, but sadly it still prompts for sync confirmation in that mode. So I'm not convinced about its usefulness in bash scripts.
No, absolutely. I only used it in the sort of in the command line. Didn't use any batch files, but when you are using the command line, it gives you a nice output of what it will sync with what. So, for example, on the left-hand side, it's got your local directory. On the right-hand side, your remote directory, and then arrows left and right as to which one's newer and where it's going to be copied to and from, or whether it's going to be removed. So it titles it as copy or remove and things like this. So you can see straight away if you're sharing it maybe with someone else and you don't know actually what's been updated, you can see straight away what's likely to be copied locally and sent or what have you. So it's nice and visual. You get a do you want to do this? Yes, no, and off it goes. And I found it very simple.
Yeah, it was the failing batch mode that really lost this one for me, I'm afraid, because other than that, the thing works really well and it's very simple and straightforward. But my main use case would be to have whatever I'm going to be using in this case actually running in a cron job, say syncing up every 5 minutes or something like that. So all my machines stay absolutely in sync. And unfortunately, with the batch mode being broken, I couldn't use bsync for this.
Yeah, you've absolutely taken the rug from under my feet, because that I would set it up like that as well. Or maybe on shutdown, do a sync, and you don't want it to ask you if you want to do it. You just want it to happen when you shut the computer down. So that sort of undermines bsync for me. But working up the alphabet, how did you find csync?
Okay, let's tell people about it for a start. It's a library and a command line tool, and it's released under the LGPL. Bsync we didn't mention, but that's actually a GPL v3 application. Now, for Ubuntu, they recommend installing csync via a PPA. Now, unfortunately, there are no files for Trusty, which is what I'm running, available, and the PPA hasn't been updated for a few years, so that didn't really help. I grabbed the tarball and tried compiling it, and that was a very painful exercise. And even when I had, it refused to see the library file, even though it was present, so it wouldn't actually run for me. How about yourself, Jesse? Any further than that?
I think I'm basically going to mirror your experiences. The PPA didn't work. I'm clearly running too old in Ubuntu. I untiled and installed, and it just wouldn't compile. And I couldn't, no matter all of the error messages I tried to get round and try and, solve all them all so I can make it compile and install. And I just couldn't do it. And I just didn't work out what the various errors were at the end. And, you can only give these things sort of half an hour, 40 minutes of your time before you think, well, this is ridiculous. It's just not a workable solution.
Yeah, I mean, what really got me is on their website, it says, quote, a file synchronizer especially designed for you, the normal user, end quote. And if they're going to claim that, then please make it easy to install without jumping through hoops.
Yeah, so csync bites the bullet by the fact that neither of us got it installed.
Yeah, and to really rub salt into the wound, after I had got most of it working, apart from the fact it wouldn't actually run, there wasn't an uninstall rule in the make file, so I was left with cleaning up my disk manually, which is not a very clever thing. Anyway, let's move it on and talk about Bitpocket. Now, this is a bash script that wraps around rsync. It's not in the Ubuntu repos, but it's easily downloadable from GitHub, and it's MIT licensed. And it works, but I wasn't very happy with it. How did you find it?
Yes, you can either copy the GitHub branch and install it that way, or I decided to use curl and pull it down. And the command they give you, obviously curls the GitHub website, and it copies it to your home partition /bin/bitpocket. But I've never seen a system which has a home partition /bin, and so it wouldn't download. So what is the point in making your commands to download it point it at a directory that very few people have? So you simply edit that command, change with chmod +x the bitpocket command into a executable, and then move it into your actual main bin directory, and then you can run it from anywhere. I also found it not ideal. It was a bit more difficult because what you had to do was firstly set up a master folder. So in my setup, the master folder would be on the server, and that is the one folder it then looks at to sync. So when you have your sort of local folder, maybe on your laptop or your PC, you then have to go into that folder on your local machine and initiate the sync from within the folder. You can't just point to it from anywhere. You have to actually be in the folder, initiate the Bitpocket sync to the master. And once you've done that, it will synchronize those two directories, but only when you've gone back into that directory and then synced from within the directory. And it seemed quite rigid on the fact that you had to be in the directory to start with in order to sync it with the master.
Yeah, I think very much like bsync we were talking about earlier, because this is a wrapper for rsync, the way it gets around rsync's limitations is by creating a whole bunch of hidden files to actually keep track of what it's got up to, so it can do this proper two-way synchronization, and that causes problems for all of these tools, I think. I mean, I had particular issues with this trying to do remote syncing. I created a master on DigitalOcean Droplet, and it sort of worked once or twice, and then it froze, and I ended up having to kill the process. And that obviously left all the sync files, the lock files, actually intact. So then you have to go back to all of your directories and delete those before it'll work again. And it also caused me a problem when I was downloading some files from the server in the first place and then tried to run Bitpocket, and it actually just locked up the whole session. So I lost both SFTP sessions.
Oh, that does not sound ideal. My gripe was slightly less critical. It was that from my main PC, I have passwordless access to my server. So I've got, I've synchronized the keys and it doesn't need a password. So when syncing that, flawless, absolutely brilliant, and was happy with how it worked. When I then went to my laptop, which I don't have the SSH keys sorted out, I just type the password in. You have to type the password in 5 times in order to get one sync done. And when testing this, you're obviously changing files and moving folders and testing it, trying to make it work, as in physically working it. And then when you have to type the password in 5 times every single time, it just drove me up the wall. So you SSH into the server, save the current state, pull the changes, push the changes, and then save after sync. And each one of those actions requires a password. It was awful. And then on top of that, if you wanted to do it locally, so this was, from my network to my network, it had to be initialized there and then. Absolutely fine. If you then wanted to take your laptop outside and sync remotely, you couldn't. You could only sync what you had initialized. So you couldn't actually have one folder synchronized both locally and remotely. You'd have to have 2 different folders and only ever stay either remote and SSHing in or locally and using your own network. It just seemed stupid. Whereas the bsync one, you could just specify, okay, while I'm on my home network, it's my 192.168 yada yada, and when I'm outside, it's my outside IP address, and you can actually specify it for the same folder for 2 different instances. So I really wasn't very fond of Bitpocket.
Yeah, I think it's fair to point out, before we get lots of mail from folks, there are plenty of ways out there of doing this. I mean, applications like Unison will do this quite happily and does work well. But what I was looking for was something really simple. I was looking for something in the mold of the traditional Unix, do one thing, do it well, nice, simple, self-contained little solution. And I failed to find one.
I thought I'd found one with bsync, and they've ruined it for me by telling me that it doesn't work in command.
Yeah, I must admit, I was very happy with bsync until I realised the batch process side of it wasn't actually functional.
Well, is that something that could be fixed, do you think?
Yeah, I'd think so, quite straightforwardly, because the only issue it seems to have is it continues to prompt you when it should be in a non-interactive mode. So I would have thought that's just a little bit of code change there, and with it being Python, either the author or someone else could dive in and do it.
Are you not particularly proficient with Python then, Paddy?
I'm not, no. It's a big girls' blouse of a language.
Well, maybe someone out there might pick it up and fix it, and if they do that, it sounds like it could do the job then, bsync.
It could, but still, it's a wrapper for rsync, and that gives it a lot of advantages. It means the author doesn't have to code loads of details about how to deal with local as opposed to SSH sessions and such like. But it does mean it's reliant on rsync and changes that happen there, and it makes it quite a bloaty sort of thing. I mean, it's only a script to wrap around that. So why someone hasn't just gone out and written a tool to do this? I mean, two-way syncing is one of those problems that is hard but difficult, or difficult but hard. I don't know which way around the phrase should be. I mean, there are quite a lot of variables to consider about what happens, for instance, with conflicts and how you deal with conflict resolution. But an application that offered a variety of options where you just feed it a few command line parameters to actually tell it what to do, I wouldn't have thought would be beyond the wit of man, but I haven't come across one for Linux.
So not a very successful test by the sounds of things. But if anyone out there knows of a solution for this problem, then it sounds like Paddy would very much like to know about it.
Yeah, given the conclusions from this and given the recommendation and the feedback, I'm going to go and have a look at SyncThing straight after this.
Well, you're free to do so, but it doesn't meet my criteria, which is a nice, simple, self-contained, easy to use command line program that isn't complex. And SyncThing doesn't tick the simplicity box for me, I'm afraid, any more than Unison does.
Okay, so we're still searching, and hopefully one of the listeners will have some feedback for us on a better application.
Yeah, hopefully. But with that then, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter, Google+, or Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, people.
See you later.